Welcome to Behind the Teams. I'm your host, Nicole Howe. My career has been defined by a search for what separates the good from great. I've looked at this from the court as a professional athlete, through the lens of psychology throughout my studies, and now on the inside of product and design recruitment. On this podcast, we sit down with leaders to dig into their experiences and their beliefs and behaviors around building high-performing teams. Today, I'm joined by Jim Nelson. Jim has spent his career building digital ecosystems that drive measurable commercial growth. He is now the head of digital at Beyond Blue, one of Australia's most trusted mental health organisations. In our conversation, we covered what it was like moving from fast-paced e-commerce environments into the mental health care sector. We looked at why conversion is a wrong metric for Beyond Blue and the tension of bringing a commercial mindset into Beyond Blue or into the non-for-profit space in general. We also looked at what has changed in how Jim builds his teams and why alignment and cause now matter more to him than raw talent. Let's get into it. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Jim. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to be having this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I know that we're kind of going to dig into a few different things, but I thought it might be really nice to start off just so the listeners can get a bit of a sense of Jim as a leader. It's a big question, but can you reflect back? Because you've been leading people for how long now?
It's been decades in one form or another. So it's definitely, I've got some street miles on me, as it were.
Doesn't look like it. But can you point to a moment where you think back now and you think, actually, that has really shaped me as a leader and really shaped who I am?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I think very early on in my career, I was very lucky to encounter a leader who wasn't just someone who sat levels above the actual work that was being done in the team, but was very much just shoulder to shoulder, demonstrating technical capability, pragmatism, decision making, actually being part of the delivery process, making sure their skills were up to speed, making sure that they were credible in their craft. It was really the first point that it clicked that you can be an effective leader and not be removed from the tools. In fact, you can actually excel as a leader if you maintain that level of hands-on capability. And that was the thing that most accelerated me, because it was clear that there was a path forward that I could both lead, but I could stay doing the things that give me joy and make me credible in the industry. So that operational leader mindset, that first thing that I encountered quite early on, that was definitely one of the things that shaped me to go, okay, there is that avenue forward. And that's how I've tried to model my progression.
That's so interesting because obviously nowadays, like in market in general, I know obviously there's places that will differ from place to place, but that is such a trend, like to have leaders that are still really hands-on. Do you think you seek those environments out, or you would get into any place and kind of make it more hands-on if you aren't close enough to the details?
If I sort of honestly look at the roles that I've run to versus the roles that I've run from, it's definitely the ones where there's a bigger mess to fix or more problems to solve, and I can actually be a part of it. It's the same leader that also said very early on that you end up with that mindset that you run into the burning building, as it were. So I think where I find I stagnated the most is when I am just in meetings or leading and I'm actually removed from that process. So I definitely run to opportunities where you can both build the team and solve the most problems and just actually get right into the heart of it.
Well, you've run into an amazing organization now, being at Beyond Blue. I'm interested to know what drew you to it, and is there anything that kind of going into that mental health space and the well-being space? Did you know a lot about it? Did you get in there and realize some things that maybe you had held assumptions about being in a non-for-profit or mental health org that you've just been relieved of? Talk me through that a little bit.
Sure. So I prior to Beyond Blue, I was working in a startup space that had a very dispersed and small team across several different countries, lots of time zones, lots of the usual trauma and challenges you'd expect from a struggling startup. But it was all throughout the pandemic. So it had that dial turned all the way up, and everything that was a small pressure then became a major pressure. So I definitely think that I came out of that space with a greater level of awareness of good mental health and, ensuring that you balance this concept of burnout and what's healthy. Definitely had a greater awareness than I would have had earlier in my career. So I naively thought that I was more prepared as I stepped into a work for purpose phase to come out and say, okay, actually, I want to do something more impactful, more meaningful. And I believe I was armed with a little bit more maturity around that concept of mental health. And I was deeply disabused of that notion very early on. It's an industry that I had very little understanding about. So it's been a very rapid education process for the last couple of years. It's definitely challenging, but in a good way, because obviously it's all progressing and learning. Probably the thing that surprised me the most when I came in, and still does, is as progressive as places like Australia are, there is still some deep stigma around mental health and a willingness to talk about it, which is representative as well in how people interact with a lot of our digital touch points. But there's also a very
Mm.
heavy normalization of some really unhealthy mental health pressures, a workplace burnout and stress, and all of these things that we predispose to shrug off and say, oh, we're just going to push through this and get on the other side. So it's very hard to both monitor and moderate a team to make sure you're having a healthy work environment, but also working to a high delivery output, which is what most of us have spent our careers developing that muscle memory for.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point. I think also just thinking more broadly with all of us coming through COVID, even if we weren't working at a startup that was dialed up to 100, like I think a lot of us probably felt a lot of pressure to, working arrangements. If you were in a digital space, that was like, obviously everyone was focusing on getting, transformation, making sure that people could access different products and services from a digital standpoint. I don't know whether we've just become complacent with that instability and pressure and work just bleeding between, because a lot of us do now work hybrid, the bleed between work and life. So yeah, I think it's something that we can all do a better job of. Is it something that you feel within the team and within yourself, because you're confronted with it now every day, right? It's something
Wow.
that you have to think about because you're in that space. Is it a bit overwhelming? Do you feel like it's within the organization? Is it talked about a lot, like that overarching vision, or do you guys break it down more day to day so it feels a little bit more disconnected?
No, we do actually try to make sure that there's a very healthy discussion around it internally. And look, as well as that, one of the things that I probably had very little experience with before I came here is the reality of the fact that people are dealing with the subject matter, which by its very nature will be triggering either initially or over time. The irony is
Yeah.
that if the majority of the content, say, you're delivering for a key digital experience is about workplace stress and burnout, and there's a deadline to meet, and there are pressures to deliver
Hmm.
this, it can be really challenging. Literally, the first task that I had when I'd stepped into this role was to migrate stewardship of a suicide prevention app to one of our sector partners, as they were better placed to support it. Now, coming off the back of selling expensive tech or face cream, this is a real consequential shift in thinking. And so, as part of the things internally that we were dealing with, there was lots of psychological safety training and lots of support for all of the team who were working on that simple process of compartmentalizing and migrating code and doing all of the standard functions that you would expect to do for handling any kind of digital product. But just through the layer of the fact that the content in there is by its very nature very consequential. So there is a lot of discussion, there is a lot of talk here. It does slow things down, but it's a safety consideration that I've seen have a great mitigation impact. It helps people to work like that.
Yeah. Can you say more about that mindset shift? Because in your background, from my understanding, you didn't work in non-for-profit before, like, and
No.
obviously the e-com digital space that you were in, I can imagine it's always kind of let's drive conversion, sales. That shift to now being in essentially it's like care, right? And well-being and resources for people with heavy subject matter. Talk to me a little bit more about what is that shift in thinking? Did it come quite naturally? Were there habits that you had to drop?
No, habits, 100%. It was a rewiring of instinct and habit to come from a space where arguably from most commercial digital touch points, you would start with 100% of your engaged users, and you would only really care about the 2% that would actually yield an ROI, a return on investment. So you would be looking for every opportunity to tighten that funnel and just reduce the people who weren't going to give you any kind of deterministic conversion. And that is absolutely how I approach this. But realistically, and this is probably the thing that I still to this day have to try to unpick, we don't want a long-term conversion retention. We don't want people to have to come to this website continually for years and years and years. And that concept is straight away, we don't want these people to not get the help they need and then have to come back. We don't want conversion, because arguably the conversion points we have on the website are support chat or phone or all these crisis calls that
Mm,
we have, and they can be overburdened very, very quickly.
yeah.
So there is a definite shift to say that the role of a lot of what we do is this upstream education, awareness, understanding, which brings its own challenges, because if someone is new to this space of trying to understand how mental health and poor mental health is a factor in their life, then they may not have the lexicon, the taxonomy to talk about it. And so it's a case of trying to understand how you frame an education path for someone who doesn't have that understanding, or deal with people who are very much on this journey and are really coming to grips with it. So it meant that we didn't have those very pointy conversion factors that we could say, this is what success looks like. And
Yeah.
instead, we had to craft these constellation style engagement metrics to say this is reflective of how behaviorally a
Mhm.
person is getting the education, getting the understanding, and getting a visibility of the support that exists.
As
The other side to it, which is equal, oh, sorry, go.
no, you go.
The other side, which is equally challenging, is, and again, it speaks to more that stigma of mental health, in addition to that risk of how sensitive this information is. At no point do we ever want to capture any identifiable or distinctive information. So it means that metrics are behavioral in many ways, and so we have to rely heavily on a lot of community research and a lot of insight that helps us build this model together and understand how it plays out from a behavioral standpoint, and then
Right.
try to define success metrics off the back of that.
So what you're saying is you can't collect like in a normal kind of digital ecosystem. Obviously, we're trying to build up this persona of our users, but you're saying that you guys can't do that because there's some
We
concerns. Or,
choose not to. So, for example, if you look at how you would operate in a commercial environment where you would
Mhm.
be enriching your first user data information to understand what are the websites you visit, what your propensity is to convert, there's a very deliberate decision with Beyond Blue to not do that,
Yeah.
to not profile people to understand correlation between the subject matter that they're looking at versus where they've come from or what they're doing. And that in itself means that there's a lot of largely native best practice industry tooling that we will just choose not to use, because it would be, well, sad to say, it would be very easy to profile people
Yeah.
with that tooling.
Yeah. So is it when you were looking at measures of success then, do you feel like it's still a bit of an experimentation for you guys to figure out, are we measuring the right things and getting because I'd imagine what you guys, the changes that you guys make and the ultimate goal of the person that's coming to Beyond Blue, it can be quite far away, right? Like how do you know that you guys are being effective? Is that something that you still have to experiment with?
It is something we still have to experiment with. It's a place in which there's a greater emphasis and value placed on that CX community research
Right.
upstream. So whereas in a normal environment you would have this multivariate testing mindset, you'd be looking to get things in market and test and ideate, we
Mm,
would probably do more community research work to understand what problem we're trying to solve
mm.
ahead. Because it is just so challenging to try to get a deterministic outcome from the data.
So as a leader then, obviously with someone that has so much experience in digital, what because you can't then always lean on best practice, right? How are you navigating then?
It is very different in some ways. The best practice, I still think a lot of the best practice principles stand as a point of reference to say the reason these best practice tools and these methodologies exist is because they really have a high certainty of confidence that this is the outcome and this is the behavior we expect. I think
Mhm.
they're still viable, but it means that in a lot of cases, we have to be creative and actually start to go, we're going to define a success metric, which is perhaps dependent upon multiple points. And I do say this with some sadness. The statistical significance that you'd need to meet is pretty easy because of the sheer volume of people who come to the website. It's in the millions, as you can imagine.
Mm,
And it means that we do start to see such significant data points come through. It means that we can test things with a very, very high segment confidence.
that's
But again,
interesting.
a lot of it is I think a lot of it is working on subject matter experts internally to help parse out what some of the data means.
That's a really like tough double-edged sword because it's like, it's great that you guys have that amount of data that you can see if things are making a difference, but sad really, right? To think about the fact that you do have that much traffic to be on Blue.
Yeah. And it just grows. In my tenure here, I've seen a quite saddening spike in traffic to a lot of different areas, and you can literally correlate it to events that are happening in the community.
Wow. What about the assumptions that people might have about non-for-profits from the outside or organizations that are dealing with, mental health and not being, I guess the other way to word it is not being in a commercial environment,
Mm.
budgets, things like that are always really tight, the pressure of that. How have you found, was it as expected coming into Beyond Blue?
It was as expected. I think Beyond Blue is probably in a slightly better position than a lot of the people in the sector.
Mhm.
I was expecting to have to get very comfortable with the budgetary constraints. I think probably what I wasn't quite expecting. So I knew that there wasn't any money. We know this. And it means that without any kind of a tie-in to a direct revenue model, it means that even the best business case in the world for a new investment in tech capability or capacity will still fall if there's just no money to back it, even if it was necessarily the right thing to do. So that was more or less as expected. Probably the thing which I wasn't quite prepared for, and I understand in principle, but it's a challenge, is that the level of governance and risk assessment associated with every and single investment, because obviously the fiduciary nature of the org is that if we've been given a donation from someone in the community or from whatever source, it always has to be put through the most critical evaluation to make sure it's the right investment. It's not money wasted. So it means that there is this heavy approval process, a risk assessment. There's such a granularity to how everything's looked at. It's a very long and often frustrating process. Even though everyone who's involved in that process understands why it has to be this way, it can never be viewed as playing fast and loose. So there are definite financial constraints, but even when they're opened up, it's a slower path to actually initiate and get work done.
So is it slower on the front end because you've got to go through all of that? Once you, let's say you did see a business case to invest in some sort of emerging tech that's coming through, you go through that process. Is it still quite slow once you're in it, or are you able to move at different paces at that point?
We can move at a slightly different pace. And this is where I think having that capability set up, where something that once it moves into, say, my team,
Hmm.
it's where we operate with a little bit more of a pure agile approach, and then we can actually kick things up and move at a faster pace. But at that very, very initial onset, it can be really quite slow and protracted.
Have you found, like, what have you learned about building that business case to get funding for the initiatives that you guys want to go through? Like, have you found that you've understood it in a different way where now you're kind of hitting on certain points, or would it depend?
It does depend. Probably the two competing factors that I find. The first one is benefit to the community. If you can demonstrate benefit to the community, that helps move the needle a lot. And this is where having that rigor in place to identify need is crucial. So it is, what I've learned is that one of the secret sources to get a business case across the line is to articulate and illustrate exactly how much this will benefit the community, or if it's a private or commercial sector, how much it would benefit this key customer group. Once that's demonstrated, then everything just starts a clock to say, the longer we draw this out, the longer this community group doesn't get the help they need. And I possibly lean quite heavily on that in order to get things across the line.
I read an article somewhere, forgetting where it was now, about the migration that you guys did recently. Because I think, did you move on to Sitecore?
We
That
did,
was
yes. We moved on to Cycle.
the thing that struck me out of that article was I read it and I was like, my God, it was like back up against the wall. The whole place is on fire. It was like, it felt so intense, even from just kind of reading it. And I thought, I mean, it is a good way to get stuff done when everything feels there's time pressure on it, because you do, because again, at the end, there's obviously a really important reason why you guys are doing it. And to have that, whatever that thing is, not be there is so
Mm.
consequential. Have you found that that really helps? Do you get a bit of like, I feel like, again, going all the way back to the start of the conversation, it can burn you out as a leader to be like, I've got to make this case and I've got to really, push hard
Yeah.
on it. Do you feel that?
I do, definitely. And I think it's a shared responsibility that pretty much every team feels in the org. I don't think anyone is sitting in a place like Beyond Blue or a startup or even just any kind of commercial business and not felt that they're part of the cause, as it were. But for
Mm,
here, it was the thing which got cut through, and that's probably the one thing which I. All the things that I've got on my toolkit that I'm relying on most at the moment is trying to find the point of cut through where you can try to tone down or mute a lot of the discussion. And even if it's a deferment to say, look, we can talk about this later, but we need to act now. It helps when there's a consequence.
yeah.
Look, it also helps equally when there's absolutely no time spent or wasted trying to point out blame. You never
Mm,
bother to litigate why you're in the situation you're in. It doesn't matter. Don't care. You're just focused on the solution. And yeah, it's a pragmatism that'll win out. And again,
mm,
you can just point to the consequence. Even if the consequence is just a likelihood that something, in this case, quite catastrophic could happen, like we need to do this right
yeah.
now.
Like it's a worthy thing to do. On the flip side of that, have you ever felt like the limited resources that you guys have has created like more creativity in the way that you solve problems? Has it pushed you somewhere better?
Look, it has, but I would say by that same token, I definitely feel as though you have to be creative, but there's always a level of compromise there, which can somehow, it makes it feel a tiny bit hollow. So we definitely have been creative in a lot of our solutions, but again, it's the pragmatism that's won out. And as a really basic example, there's no better way to introduce agile ways of working into a traditional org, more so than when there's a situation like this. And so you can use that to say, this is how you can get to a point of ideation and do more. In terms of how we are creative, I have definitely seen. So one example, when we did the site migration, we did an audit of some of the assets that we had on the site, some of the quote unquote products. One of them was a well-being tool, and it was only during that migration when we're looking at the thousands of pages and all the different assets that looking at the data, we noticed that this one well-being tool, and to be clear, when I call it a well-being tool, it was actually just a PDF document. It
Right.
was based on a lot of research, a lot of ideation, a lot of really cohesive work. But years ago, the only output for it was as a PDF. And that was just put on the site, say, here is a well-being toolkit. One of the most downloaded assets on the website, thousands of times a day, this PDF is downloaded. And obviously the view was we need to migrate this across. The digital agency that we were partnered with at the time just kept looking at this one PDF and saying, this is such a heavily utilized asset. And I know we don't have the bandwidth or the time to move it across, so we're just going to keep it as a PDF and transition it. And they actually set about off their own back and on their own merit. This is a fantastic agency called Luminary. And they'd off their own back said, we've built a proof of concept app
Wow, cool.
based on that PDF. And they turned this around in a matter of weeks and said, look, we know that this is something that you weren't really in the position to do. We
Mm,
wanted to get back. And so we just synthesized this PDF creatively into a very simple app. And in the 6 months that followed, we managed to build it out into a more robust state and deployed it. And that wasn't on the roadmap and it wasn't on the plan, but we ended up with this created well-being app, which is now in the App Store. And that was just a function that came out of someone who just saw a thing and said, this is a high trafficked asset. And the journey to make this an interactive element is shorter for us than it is for anyone else. And so they did it.
that's amazing. And I guess proof as well that the solution doesn't have to be super complex as well. Like
No.
it's lived as a PDF for how long? And obviously it was useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's best. Because you've been in so many different environments, both in terms of like commercial versus non-for-profit, but also different size of organizations, have you seen a common thread within digital teams that are really high performing? Is there something about the people in the space or when you're hiring a certain trait that you look for when building teams?
My personal view around this is that ensuring that the team is always centered around the work as opposed to being locked into the roles. So it's that really clear articulation and understanding of jobs to be done and making
Hmm.
sure that that's that main focus. So you can end up with a team that can look very ordinary and unimpressive on paper, but there's a very clear understanding of what the jobs to be done are and how that fits in and who's doing the work and and whether they need autonomy versus coordination, whether their output is based on predictability or whether it's a variable. So getting to the grips on that, it does mean that it pulls focus away from the actual roles and the titles and the hierarchy, it gives you more opportunity to reduce the friction and just focuses on what the actual output is. So
Mm.
I definitely think having that clear view of jobs to be done and using that as a lens to try to pull out all of the ego and a lot of the unnecessary friction from a team,
Yeah.
it's to me that precursor to high performance.
Have you, in this space, in Beyond Blue, have you hired people with experience in health, mental health, well-being, or have you built a team that is a little bit more diverse?
Interestingly enough, it was a decision that my exec, when I came on board, had chosen that she had built out a team to deliver this digital evolution program.
Mm.
And she'd not chosen people with sector or mental health experience, but rather chose people from the private sector or commercial or people with a background in digital or tech or e-commerce. I sort of took note of that at the time, and I've definitely kept that as a playbook in my
Mm.
time here for a couple of different reasons. Probably the first one is that in terms of experience and capability, the commercial sector will always have a higher standard, especially when people have come from environments where there's a lot more competition and overt profitability. And so you definitely, and again, this is just a personal view. I do believe you get sharper skills. And the second thing is as well, there's a hunger or an appetite to do work for purpose with a lot of people who've spent a long time in that commercial environment. And even if it means when I bring someone into the team that I might only have them for a year or 2 years, because obviously they're not going to be as competitive with the salaries as they would elsewhere.
Mm.
Those will be fruitful years if the people are actually working on something passionate and they believe in, and it's a chance to step away from what can be at times a hollow experience just working in fast-moving consumer goods or tech.
Yeah. Interestingly, I think if the intention is to build out, like, you've almost created more of a draw card for people to join now. If you do have, I guess, the foundations already built, particularly from a digital standpoint, right?
Hmm.
Have you felt like an outsider within,
I definitely felt
not from a personal standpoint? That's obvious.
no, no, no. It's a really valid and sincere question. Short answer is a yes.
Okay.
Especially when what you'll come in with. I use the term to describe the skill set as sharper, but I also feel on the other side of the coin is that you run the risk, I run the risk every now and then of coming off being almost mercenary or commercial when you reduce everything down to a pragmatic decision around cost benefit or
Mm.
a path to delivery that's suggesting an MVP. Even the subject of doing any level of personalization and noting that with that personalization you will potentially be running the risk of disadvantaging a particular segment or preferencing one over the other. So yes, I definitely feel as though there is a marked difference. And it's one of the things that I actually say to people when they come on board, to
Mm.
say if they've come from a commercial background, you're going to probably find yourself feeling as though you're blunt or sharp or perhaps coming across as too commercially focused. But by the same token, we're looking to drive an output and a success and an uplift the way that we know how.
Yeah.
So,
Do you think, broadly speaking, and this isn't directed at Beyond Blue at all, but if you kind of zoom out and think, say we fast forward 10 years, do you think some of those or some of those assumptions about, because I would have the same, like if I looked at a non-for-profit, you might assume from a digital standpoint, they might be a little bit behind the curve, or from a
mm,
capability perspective, if they didn't do like what Beyond Blue did, intentionally hire from outside in to help build up some of those foundations or borrow from the commercial industry.
mm,
Do you think that can change though? Can we get to it? Because for me, it's such important work. You want the best people doing it. And that's not to say that they can't come from non-for-profit. They can, absolutely, but we can also look elsewhere. But there's obvious constraints like money and
mm.
salary, all of that stuff. But do you see that changing? Like, can you envision a world where, the best people are working there? Like, how, I guess, is it too utopian to imagine that?
I It's an interesting question because every time, at the moment, we're going into a marked financial constraint point. And so it means there's going to be less money for the not-for-profits, and it's going to be even more challenging. And
Right.
there's opportunities, especially around how workplaces are being displaced, obviously, by a lot of AI.
Mhm.
It means that people are both in the market trying to find their way forward, but also being offered inordinate amounts of money to work elsewhere. But it may not have that same satisfaction or reward. I think it's probably going to be harder for a not. If I'm honest, I think in the next 10 years, it is going to be very challenging for not-for-profits to actually get that capability in. There's going to be a lot of opportunities. The advantage is that we can lean on a lot of tooling that helps make up for that, that's emerging. But yeah, I'm probably a little bit cynical about it at the moment and concerned. But I do want to think as well on the other side, there are so many agencies that are now switching towards that work for purpose, that choose their clients carefully. And I have hired some truly exceptional people that I wouldn't probably have been able to afford or bring in a commercial environment, but their willingness to come and work for a clear cause has been a contributing factor. It's one of the reasons that I've chosen to come and work here is absolutely
Mm.
for that principle. So I hope that I'm wrong, and I love being proved wrong and things like this. There's definitely, I think, a need for people to want to be a part of something that actually has impact and change in the community.
Yeah.
I suppose our role is to make those opportunities available within the org, and
Yeah,
to make sure that the work that people do when they come here is actually meaningful.
for sure. Have you, I don't know how much you've reflected on this, but do you feel like you have, because of Beyond Blue, changed as a leader? Like, were you forced to abandon any ideas that you held from a leadership perspective now coming into this space?
Definitely. Any I think material role is obviously going to change you as a leader. The thing which I feel has changed me the most here is I probably have a little bit. I think I've got a greater sense now of how important it is when you do build a team to get their alignment to the actual strategy and the cause. I think a lot of the time I probably over-indexed on hiring the talent and
Hmm.
assuming that the work output will be good for it. Whereas here, actually having someone who's passionately aligned to say, I want to work to this cause, this North Star, and I want to deliver to it. It doesn't have to be not for profit. It could, I think, be anything. But that alignment to the cause and everyone really buying in, I've seen that make a huge difference here. And it's not always going to be a luxury that we have. And we won't all, I know that I won't always have the opportunity to work for somewhere where the cause is so overt and tangible.
Mm.
But I definitely think when I'm building a team going forward, I'm going to have a lot closer view on making sure that there's real deep alignment to what it is that we're doing.
That's really interesting. If I think back to, because I think sometimes I can be a bit cynical and think, well, at an org that's just making money, how do you set that vision and that like shared purpose? Because obviously within Beyond Blue, you can see the logic there, but anywhere else, I think to myself, like, but how are you going to get everyone to buy in on something if you are, depending on where you're working, if it is just kind of, selling really expensive SaaS, for example.
Yeah.
I do think, like, if I think back to my sporting days, it was always about winning, right? But actually, at
Mm,
the start of every season, you didn't really talk about we're going to win. You did, obviously, it was implicit, but you talked about, well, what are the values that we're going to build together this season?
mhm.
What are we actually going to go towards? That's going to help us win, obviously, but what are we actually going to agree on that this is the thing that we're going to drive together? And I do think that is missing in a lot of teams.
It is the case where look, even I find myself falling back into that habit when you apply for a key role in your team and you'll get hundreds of applicants and you'll start to shortlist them and you focus more on the dot points on the resume rather than the narrative on the cover letter, or trying to understand
Mm.
the context of why it is that they want to work here. You basically just, I find myself occasionally going, okay, they've got all the skills, they can do this, they've got all this, okay, they're clearly the best person for the job. And that's the
Mm.
one thing now which I'm going, getting that fit is probably worth a lot more than I think I realized before.
Very interesting, because I do think the market is definitely saying more and more like, well, what's the outcome of this person's work? And
Mm.
like, just tell me the thing, right? Instead of all the stuff that you've just mentioned. Is there anything
Right.
else that you would tell counterparts in commercial environments about what maybe they can learn from leading in the space that you're in from a digital standpoint?
But probably one of the things that I've also switched, and it's I think more around the times that we're in at the moment. Again, it speaks to the financial constraints. I think we probably need, at least for the next few years, to reduce the scope of a lot of our major projects or initiative. There's always this view where you're doing these incredibly large projects, a lot of interconnected work. But what I see increasingly is a project that spans such an epic scope. By the time it lands, so much has changed
Yeah.
now. And so I definitely think we've had to work on a more squad-based approach and had to break things down, even though it feels messier. It is still that forward momentum that we need. And
Mm.
so I think actually not democratizing, but breaking down a lot of these massive digital uplift or technical projects that businesses do to make things a little bit scrappier. I think that actually has a lot of merit, but it relies a leap of faith. It relies on a huge leap of faith to be able
Mm.
to do that and make sure that everyone is coordinated, which again speaks to if the team is aligned, then that's how we de-risk that.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating point because you're right. Like things just keep changing at such a rapid pace now that if you did have such a long term vision, it's probably going to change as well, and how you get
Yeah.
there will change. That is so interesting.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to share about, particularly beyond Blue? If there is anything that people can do that listening to support, anything to people that are maybe thinking about joining an organization that's similar, what would you say to those people?
I would definitely say that we obviously have a lot of roles that are going across the org. I know for a fact that we have ahead of us a very, very significant challenge as we start to understand the role of a lot of the emerging AI. So the opportunities that we'll have to draw on that subject matter expertise for some key roles is critical. So definitely, if anyone is in that industry and of a space, and there are any jobs available that you can see listed in my team or across data and insights or CX, please make sure that they apply. As well as that, if there's a desire or inclination to help beyond Blue, we absolutely are always seeking any kind of community donation to help run our support and chat lines, and those can all be found on the website. There's a lot of key events that we do across the community that we invite people to participate in as part of the community. And in addition to a lot of our services and products, we have, as I've said before, released a wellbeing app that is in various stages of development. So that's available from the App Store. So we're definitely in doing what we can to increase our scope and our reach, providing support where we can, and hiring good people as much as possible.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate your time and all your
Thank you so
insights.
much for having me on. Absolute pleasure.
That's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, follow Behind the Team so you don't miss the next conversation. And if you know someone who'd find this useful, send it their way. Thanks for listening. See you next time.